Episode 8. I was never a good person. Mary's heart started beating faster than she could count. She looked up slightly and saw that her fierce deskmate's eyes were squinted, and she was even whistling. Her voice was casual, and she had one hand in her pocket. She turned to the side and looked at the cars of teenagers around her. Why is this girl still laughing? Wondered Mary. There were too many rumors about the school bully. The thought of it turned Mary's legs into jelly. She clutched Bessie's wrist, her knuckles raised and her fingertips white. Not far away. Kenneth, Brian and the others who bullied our classmates are right in front of you. Paul was anxious. He bit his cigarette, touched his hair and raised his eyebrows at Kenneth. Kenneth raised his eyebrows. His appearance was mild, but his eyes were cold. What does it have to do with you? His gaze fell on the crowd in front of him. In the middle, the girl with her back to him casually stood there. She was rather tall and skinny and didn't look over. In the setting sun, her face was bright and demonic. She looked calm and arrogant, and was clearly a tough one. Kenneth paused. It was no wonder Paul dragged him here too. The scene was indeed entertaining. Kenneth, why did you stop? Kenneth didn't answer, so Paul grew anxious. His hair was short and stiff and matched his stubbornness. Brian, that guy got out of his car. Okay, forget about it if you don't like our new classmate. But you've known that girl in the student committee for 2 years. Can you really leave her to die? Kenneth seemed a little silent, so Paul didn't think much about it and just thought he had agreed. He took a step forward and said loudly, Mary, bring the new classmate over here and make way for Brian. Paul's voice was quite anxious. As Mary heard Paul's voice, she lowered her eyes and pursed her lips tightly, her body tense, and her loosely fit school uniform making her seem very small and delicate. Holding Bessie's hand tightly, she walked in Paul's direction. Brian was famous for his fierceness. When he first transferred to the school, he became the leader of the local bandits. His reputation as the school bully spread widely. The rumors in Brightbow High were all about his evil deeds. He had a tough background, and even the underworld didn't dare to mess with him. How could these regular students possibly afford to mess with him? Even Mary, a good student, had heard of him. After what Paul said, she quickly pulled Bessie and wanted to drag her away. But Bessie's feet stayed glued to the ground. She wouldn't move. Holding his cigarette, Paul grew anxious and ran a hand through his hair. Damn it, what's wrong with this new popular girl? Does she want to fight? Brian isn't so easy to mess with. Kenneth, say something. This new classmate had an arrogant temper and was somewhat wild. She was like a young pup who wasn't afraid of bears. Brian and his friends all had a bad reputation in Chicago University, and the students were all afraid of him. He had always been ruthless, and no one could handle him. After Thomas graduated, he wasn't too scared of Brian. The two gangs were on bad terms, and their main interaction was the welcome meeting for the new Brightbow High School students. Anne was quite known among her peers. One day, Brian and the boys barged in and laughed at Anne's music. Kenneth stood up to Brian. Everyone thought he deliberately picked a fight, and Kenneth was a freshman at the time. He had just transferred over, and Brian chose not to fight him in the end. Since that incident, Paul knew that Brian was scared of Kenneth. Now that Bessie was being so stubborn, Paul couldn't help but want to slip away in her place and cursed under his breath. Did she want to die? Mary watched the school bully get out of his car, her face turning even paler. She said in a trembling voice, Bessie, we have to go quickly. I'll explain it to you later. She was still pulling on Bessie, her palms sweaty and trembling. This reaction was expected from an ordinary student who saw the school bully that even the underworld didn't dare touch. Bessie patted Mary's shoulder. Her expression didn't change, and she stuck her hand in her pocket, squinting at them. She still acted like a big boss, wild and crazy. But Mary was not comforted. Her legs were soft and she couldn't move. She was about to faint. The teenager in the front walked towards them. He had beaming eyes, a distinct silhouette, and a mysterious aura. White smoke burned between his fingers, and his whole being could only be described as evil. Seeing that Brian was walking over himself, Paul finally moved. The group of people not far away also thought that this new student was finished. Kenneth looked at Brian Jake. His clear and dark eyes shifted slightly, and he was about to say something. But then he heard Bessie say, "Brian, get someone to get Mary back. She can't walk." The scene fell silent. Brian glanced at Mary and immediately laughed. It was an easygoing laugh that didn't sound like a school bully at all. He immediately turned and picked a teenager who looked like a good student to send Mary over. Then he came over again and looked at Bessie. He smiled, surprised. "Come on, Bessie, how could you not tell me you're in Chicago?" Bessie tugged at her school uniform. It was decided last minute. The letter from Principal White was already a year old. Brian was still dissatisfied. He was handsome and had defined features. "Then why didn't you text me?" "I just arrived yesterday." Bessie motioned to Mary, but when she saw that Mary was still stunned and didn't respond, she turned to her side and kicked Brian. She raised her eyebrows and said, "Tell your friends to get lost. They're scaring my friend." Brian motioned his friends to walk away. Mary was obviously not in a good state, so Bessie was ready to buy books herself. The boy beaten up by Bessie Miller at noon didn't walk away. His colorful hair drooped. "Boss, she's... Brian crushed his cigarette rather gracefully. He glanced over coldly, and the corners of his lips curled up in a smirk when he heard that. "My predecessor." He didn't even wait for them to respond. "Bessie, where are you going?" "I need to buy some books," she replied concisely. "I'll go with you." As his voice drifted away, Mary, who was still glued to the same spot, still didn't respond. The bully's friend, who she had been so terribly afraid of, said carefully to her, "Hey, are you going back to school or are you going for lunch?" Mary's head was a bit empty. She felt like she was dreaming. Not far away, Paul's side was also silent. Even Kenneth couldn't react for a while. Bessie was much calmer. She just got a few books and her phone vibrated a few times. She took it out casually. It was an undisclosed number. "There is a new mission specifically asking for you. Do you want it?" Bessie looked at the message for a while. Then she handed her books to Brian to hold before texting back. "Is the person placing the order sick?" Her price was 10 times higher than the market price. Without waiting for a reply, she quickly texted 4 more words. "I'm not taking it." Brian took her books and paid for them. He flipped through the books selected by Bessie and realized that they weren't study materials, but original copies of foreign books. They were books that were of no interest to anyone. He knew that Bessie liked to read. Bessie's entire study was full of her books, and she especially liked reading the original text. Brian had seen the original 100 Years of Solitude and Kite Chaser on her bedside. He put the books on the cash register. His shredded hair dropped slightly, and only his dark eyes were sharp. Brian paid, and Bessie didn't argue with him. After sending the message, she put her phone back in her pocket and walked outside first. Brian took the bag and walked towards her. He held the cigarette that was almost gone and was about to throw it in a trash can. "Want to have food first?" Brian waved his hand in front of her and tilted his head with a smile. Bessie shook her head. She had to go back to the dorm and study. "Give me a stick." She glanced at him. Brian knew what she was saying. He flinched back and sulked. "No, Grandma Bertha will kill me." Bessie kicked him and stared at him with her pretty bandit eyes. Brian reluctantly took out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, took one out and handed it to Bessie. Then passed her the lighter. Bessie's fingers were thin and long. They looked like jade and glowed a healthy pink. With a slight click sound, blue flames burst out. The faint smoke rose, emitting a faint smell of mint. Bessie wore jeans and a white t-shirt with a high school uniform tied loosely around it. Her soft and fluffy hair draped over her shoulders, gently ruffled by the wind. She lowered her eyes and casually leaned against the wall. Smoke rose from her fingertips, and she looked quite relaxed. There was also a sort of calmness that hadn't been in her these past few days. She was mesmerizing. Brian squatted at the intersection to help her keep a lookout. He couldn't help but glance back, frowning. A few years ago, Bessie had knocked on his door drenched in blood. He didn't know what she had just been through. He didn't ask her much about it. He didn't know how to comfort other people. He had started smoking when he was a kid, and smoking had a soothing effect. That night, Bessie and him were smoking the whole night before she was fine. It was just that she was different from him. She didn't smoke much, but when she was extremely vexed, she would hide in his house and smoke. When her grandma found out, she gave him a beating, while Bessie just had to look at Grandma innocently, and they believed that he had tricked her into smoking. "Smoking is bad for you." Brian scanned the street. He retracted when he saw that no one else was around. Now he wished he could go back to a few years ago and strangle himself before he could give her a cigarette. After smoking half of it, Bessie took it out and threw it into the trash can. She took 2 steps back and straightened her hair. When she heard Brian's voice, she casually glanced at him and chuckled. "Get lost. I've reflected on this a lot. How could I have taken you down this crooked road?" Brian pulled his collar. "What's wrong with that?" Bessie told Brian to pass the books to her. Her voice was faint, but her eyebrows gathered and she smiled cynically. "I was never a good person." "You are a good person." Brian was very serious. While we wonder about the relationship between Brian and Bessie, the mystery about the job request still remains unknown.